Thank you. Welcome to the Council on Foreign Relations, Religion, and Foreign Policy webinar series. I'm Irina Faskianis, Vice President for the National Program and Outreach here at CFR. Thank you for joining us. As a reminder, this webinar is on the record and the audio, video, and transcript will be available on CFR's website, cfr.org, and on the Apple podcast channel, Religion and Foreign Policy. As always, CFR takes no institutional positions on matters of policy. We are delighted to have with us Asla Aydin-Taşbaş and Philip Gamagelian to discuss the ethnic and territorial conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. And I will introduce them briefly, their bios, before turning to them. Ms. Asla Aydin-Taşbaş is a regular contributor to the Washington Post as a global opinions columnist. Her columns have also appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, International Herald Tribune, Forbes, Political, and elsewhere, as well as Foreign Affairs, our own magazine here, published by the Council on Foreign Relations. She's a visiting fellow in the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution and a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Philip Gamagelian is an assistant professor at the Joan B. Kroc School of Peace Studies at the University of San Diego, a conflict resolution scholar practitioner. He is the co-founder and board member of the Imagine Center for Center Transformation. He is also the author of Conflict Resolution Beyond the International Relations Paradigms, Evolving Designs as a Transformative Practice in Nagorno-Karabakh. And he's the managing editor of Caucasus Edition Journal of Conflict Transformation. Thanks to both of you for being with us to talk about conflict resolution in Armenia and Azerbaijan. I was hoping that you could give us some background on the conflict, talk about the peace talks which have stalled and where you see things going from here. So Asla, let's begin with you and then we'll turn to Philip.
Thank you, Irina, and thank you for organizing this event on a part of the world that is getting very little attention, but has been the scene of rather dramatic events back in September when there was an exodus of almost 100,000 Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh, sort of an ethnic enclave, ancestral homeland, contested area between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Before we go into the details of the conflict and some of the conflict resolution issues that my colleague Philip is really hands-on and has experience on the ground, I'd like to provide a bit of a brief background on the big picture, which is a part of the world on the periphery of Russia, almost equidistant to the two major wars that we are experiencing right now, the war in the Middle East and the war in Ukraine. And of course, this region, South Caucasus, has historically been an arena of great power competition. But over the past 100 years, it's been Russia's backyard. Really, more or less a stable course with a firm Russian hand over all the Soviet republics. And Armenia and Azerbaijan lived side by side in multi-ethnic societies for much of the past 100 years until the 90s, when both countries declaring independence and subsequently entering a war. Territory changing back and forth, Armenia occupying quite a substantial part of Azerbaijan, which in a war in 2020, and again with the Nagorno-Karabakh incident in September, Azerbaijan took back in a military offensive. But of course, not everything is over. It's a very volatile part of the world. There is both a Russia problem that comes from Russia's overreach and Russia's absence. For too long, Russia had been the provider of security, both in the region, but also specifically for Armenia. They're now otherwise occupied. What you have is a situation in which alliances are shifting and presenting a huge asymmetry between the two countries. Basically, Armenia is trying to wean itself out of Russian influence, trying to come closer to the West, essentially almost 30 years too late. Steps that other countries have taken, particularly Georgia in the region, have taken 20 years ago. But and doing so at a time when the price of trying to come close to the West, as we know in Ukraine, is almost too high. On the other hand, there is a clear power asymmetry in terms of the military power between these two countries. They have had on again, off again peace talks over since the 90s, basically, but intensely over this past year, with no results. There have been an interest in Western in European countries mediating, EU mediating, the administration mediating between Azerbaijan and Armenia, Russia mediating, and even sort of regional players. But at the end of the day, we have a draft treaty. We have everything that is may go into a peace, fundamentally a sustainable peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan, but it's not happening. Why is it not happening? Again, the great power rivalry that is happening everywhere in Russia's periphery is also happening here. There's clearly a situation in which, while Armenia wants to get close to the West, Russia does not want to do that. Russians have shown that they have been very interested in a regime change in Armenia and removing the more pro-Western elements that are in government right now, at least the more liberal-leaning elements that are in power right now, and replacing that with a power puppet regime. Meanwhile, Azerbaijan is doing an interesting balancing act between Turkey and Russia, and is now emerged as a key energy provider for Europe at a time when Europe is trying to reduce its dependency on Russian gas, providing an enormous leverage for Azerbaijan. And this reversal of alliances is also domestically, there is, in both countries, there is a situation that is dramatically different. In Armenia, you have a government that's been elected in more or less a velvet revolution, street demonstrations, and it's a democracy. And a democracy that is where the government faces opposition when it wants to take steps, particularly when it wants to take steps that nationalist Armenians consider too far. Whereas in Azerbaijan, you have more of a firm hand of the Aliyev regime, and I would say more of an illiberal, if not autocratic system, but still a domestic constituency that is demanding victory, demanding military victory, and and has gotten used to the military conquest, so to speak. I think that we have seen Turkey as an interesting element, as an interesting external factor coming into the scene and saying, we are historically, for the first time in 100 years, ready to normalize our relations with Armenia, but with the condition that Armenia and Azerbaijan sign a peace treaty. Before we do that, Turkish-Armenian border has been sealed more or less for the past 100 years. I use 100 years as a reference to 1915, the date that is considered by many to be the date of Armenian genocide, the beginning of a period of massive exodus and killing and for Armenians indigenous to the Ottoman Empire. But of course, Turkish government's desire to normalize relations with Armenia is important, except it is predicated on a peace treaty between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Right now, where things are, I think I would just sort of give a brief overview on that and leave the rest to Phil. But there is the set of negotiations and bilateral talks between the two sides has produced all the conditions for a treaty to be signed. But we have, I think, a more eagerness on the part of Armenia and a bit of a foot dragging that is happening on the part of Azerbaijan. Russia is clearly not interested in seeing a peace between the two countries. The West is interested in seeing a peace treaty between the two countries, two allies at this point, looking to the West, but doesn't have the bandwidth to get involved and push for it. Of course, the situation inside Ukraine, how that war goes, and whether or not Russia ends up in a year or two having more of the sort of military upper hand is enormously important for the knock-on effects it could have in this part of the world. So it is a dramatic time. It could lead to a wonderful peace treaty between these two countries, opening up a historic reconciliation between Armenia and Turkey, or it could lead to renewed fighting based on various border disputes or issues that are still unresolved. Quite dramatic and also maybe inconvenient in the sense that everyone is distracted. There are already two wars going on and a US elections that is sapping the energy from many of the stakeholders in the international scene.
Thank you very much. Let's go to you, Philip, to talk about the conflict resolution, please, and anything else you want to respond to from the setup that Aslı gave us.
Of course. Thank you very much, Aslı, for giving the geopolitical overview of the conflict, and thank you for inviting me to this talk as well. As a conflict resolution scholar, I'll give a bit of take a different angle, since we already covered the geopolitical one, and also go back for a minute to the 1990s, which was the time where the Armenia and Azerbaijan had their first war, a very destructive war, but in my view also the time when there was perhaps the best chance to settle this conflict. So the war in 1990s took place immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when you had wars also in Chechnya and other parts of Abkhazia, Georgia, and other parts of the Soviet Union. An empire was collapsing, and there was questions of territory and human rights and minority rights and self-determination. And this war was very violent. The 30,000 people died in that war, which is, for a small region, is a big number. But perhaps more tellingly, the entire Armenian population of Azerbaijan was displaced, and the entire Azerbaijani population of Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh, after Armenia took it over militarily, was displaced. So there was full ethnic cleansing of over 1 million people for a region that has about 10 million at that point. So more than 10% of population was displaced. Essentially, anybody of the wrong ethnicity was ethnically cleansed. So it was a very violent war. It was also very not compromising in terms of seeing each other in very mutually exclusive terms. And yet, in 1990s, I'm still believing there was the highest chance to solve the conflict, not because the leadership of that time was any more constructive, which is, I think, some misconception that we have. They fought this very violent war, but because there was a blueprint upon which the peace could have been established, which is essentially the liberal peace paradigm that we probably know a lot about. At that point, it was the end of history was pronounced. Communism lost, liberal democracies won the day. That was the assumption. And the conflict was to be solved, this and all other conflicts, were to be solved through democratization, really, of the region. So the disagreements about the belonging of Karabakh and so on always remained, and why we never had a solution. But again, the blueprint was clear and accepted by everybody. So Armenia, Azerbaijan, Russia, all that neighborhood was democratizing and integrating with the European Union at the time. And liberal peace has this very specific set of principles on which conflict was to be resolved. It starts with liberal democratic constitutions. Both Armenia and Azerbaijan accepted them in 1995. And that include very extensive provisions of human rights, minority rights. There was also marketization, liberalization of the markets. And the idea there is that then you have economic integration, and through economic integration that markets bring, you have more interdependency. Another piece is institutionalization of civil society. And as you have strong civil society, then you will have conflicts that they will be solved through or addressed through democratic means. You can see that, I don't know, in Scotland, in Quebec, right? So you have conflict, ethnic conflict, it doesn't go to violence. So this was to be the blueprint of solution in some form, right? You will have a conflict, disagreement, but it will be handled through democratic means. That clearly did not work, but why I believe in 90s there was the highest chance to solve it. Now, we can ask why it didn't work. And for many reasons, the ethno-nationalism dominated. For example, the human rights, minority rights provisions in both countries were never applied to whoever they saw as the enemy. So Armenia never applied their human rights provisions to Azerbaijanis, never let displaced Azerbaijanis return. Same is in Azerbaijan. Marketization happened, but it never led to any economic connectivity. The borders remained closed. Civil societies developed, but they never again took on the integration of the other side or advocacy for the other side into their agenda. So essentially, the democratization never led to the assumed support for the solution of the conflict. So that was in 1990s. Since then, the conflict steadily escalated. And in 2016, there was a very major escalation. In 2020, there was the Second Karabakh War. That first one was won by Armenia, this one was won by Azerbaijan. That then was followed by full ethnic cleansing of Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh. And we have now an interesting situation where the conflict in a way has been dealt with very through military violent means by Azerbaijan's victory in the Second Karabakh War, and yet we don't have a solution. So it's a strange situation when there is no really driver of a conflict. In a way, the cause of the conflict, disagreement about Karabakh, is removed. Armenia government, despite some displeasure from the population, perhaps is not claiming it anymore, and yet we are not seeing any serious move towards the solution. And question is why? And in my view, again, we go back to this question of there is no blueprint on which you can have a stable solution. Democratization didn't work as a conflict resolution mechanism even when it was happening, and today is not even happening. So as I mentioned, Armenia itself, as well as Georgia and Moldova and Ukraine in that neighborhood are democratizing, are trying to stay democratic. But the rest of the neighborhood is not yet. Azerbaijan, Turkey, Russia, Iran, of course. A lot of the neighboring states, big states, are actually becoming more and more autocratic. So this democratic approach to solution is not necessarily workable in a condition where most of the neighborhood is heavily autocratic. And the democratization comes with a heavy price. I agree that Armenia is late in a way to the game, but it's not like those who attempted to democratize early didn't pay a heavy price. So Georgia, who tried to democratize 20, 30 years before Armenia, also paid a heavy price, lost big parts of territory, faces two wars in its own territory. Ukraine, we are seeing what's happening as a result of trying to democratize. Moldova is potentially under a threat of invasion, has its own conflict. So basically every country that attempts to democratize and break away from very autocratic Russian influence ends up facing essentially war or invasion in its territory. So we have this very volatile situation that Asli mentioned, and where to go from here. In my view, conflict resolution as such that was possible in the 90s is not possible, again, because we don't have this consensus, international consensus that everybody will become liberal democracies and through integration to European Union structures and in some form replicating post-World War II European experience, right? So solving it through democratization and economic integration. That blueprint is not possible given a heavily autocratization of the majority of the region. So with that out, my proposal has been recently to governments to think in a long term about transformation of the conflict. As I said, even when they were more democratic, they never really applied human rights provisions or anything to the other. It's a very heavy investment by both governments throughout 30, 40 years into building enemy image and hatred towards the other side. we need to really divest from it, and that includes education system. It includes political speeches that could go full fascist, I would say, essentially fully excluding the other side and advocating for violence, normalizing violence. So that has to be unwinded as a long term as that was built. Yeah, we need to completely reform the education systems and political speech and what else. So one support to this region will be to invest and encourage them to move away from this kind of rhetoric and narratives in history education and political speeches and media as we move forward, since again the drivers of the conflict are not necessarily present. But that's a longer term. In the shorter term, I believe there is an importance to invest in conflict management, not necessarily solution, but minimizing the chance for a new war emerging. If the war until recently was in the internationally recognized territory of Azerbaijan and disputed territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, there is now a chance of it moving into the territory of Armenia. And now we will have the reverse situation, but also quite non-solvable if Azerbaijan is to take over part of Armenian territory. So presumably that is not in the interests of Armenia for sure, the region in general, I believe, but also the Western partners, because as Asli also pointed out, Russia has ruled this region essentially through keeping the conflicts alive and kind of playing the sides against each other. So in that sense, the region itself, of course, can benefit from peace, but also the Western partners should be interested in seeing peaceful region, because that helps them more to democratize and move away, or at least diversify its foreign policy and move away from full control by Putin's Russia. And this is where we don't see necessarily enough. Perhaps we see enough investment at this point, I would say, from the West, but it's not consistent. So there has been heavy investment from the West towards democratization of this region during Clinton and Bush presidencies. You saw complete pullback of the region during Obama and Trump presidencies, where the region was looked upon through the prism of relations of US with Russia. And essentially the region was handed over to Russia as its playground to manage. For example, even negotiations between Armenia and Azerbaijan were always led by US, France, and Russia together, other than in the period when Barack Obama comes to power and effectively outsources this fully to Russia and endorses Russian-led single-track process. Right, so you have suddenly more investment into the region from the Biden administration, but there is this hesitation, and you have Macron also. France is very heavily involved, very different from the past. But there is always a hesitation what's going to happen past November, right? So can we count on essentially US being present in the region past November? Are we waiting 4 years and then we are on our own again? Yeah, so this more systematic investment being more part of a longer term strategy to democratize and integrate with the West is really important. And that's one area where more consistency could help really, again, divest somewhat from dependence on Russia. So I will stop there and turn to questions. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you both. That was a really great overview and update on where we are. I'm going to go to all of you now for your questions. You can click the raise hand icon on your screen to ask a question. And when you're called upon, please accept the unmute prompt. State your name and affiliation. You can always also submit a written question via the Q&A feature in your Zoom window, and I will read the questions. And if you do that, if you could please identify yourself, that would be great. Let me just look at if we have any raised hands. Not yet. So maybe we could just dig a little bit. Oh, we do. We had a question that just went away. Yes. Okay, great. Peg Chamberlain.
Hi. Could you speak a little bit to the role of the faith community over these years, whether that's the Orthodox community, the relationship Ukrainian Orthodox and Russian Orthodox, whether it's some of the more invasive evangelicals, where are they carrying political agendas? How are they being helpful? and so forth. Thank you.
You can, I don't see you coming in, so I'll start, I guess. Coming off the Soviet, out of Soviet Union, these have been very secular and countries. Some of the countries in the neighborhood, specifically Ukraine and Georgia, maintained bigger, perhaps religious community. That has been changing, of course, throughout past 30 years. In Armenia specifically, you see comeback of the Apostolic Church, Armenian Apostolic Church, many new churches building, and the religious community is becoming more active in domestic politics, in domestic civil society, in education matters. In Azerbaijan, a bit less so. It has been somewhat seen as, it's been partially encouraged, but in a very government control fashion, while kind of more genuine expansion of religious movements have been seen as a potential political threat and has been suppressed. But you have, I think, we don't see much of an involvement of faith communities in any form and shape, neither from outside nor internally in the normalization or peace process. There have been maybe 1 or 2 meetings between religious leaders, but they've been organized by Moscow actually about maybe 15 years ago last time, if I'm not wrong. So it was very more like government organized symbolic event rather than any kind of genuine reaching out. And within the country, I will not speak of Azerbaijan, but which is more the religious community, I think, is dealing with political repressions than the conflict. In the Armenian case, currently the institutional church is positioning itself in rather opposition, I would say, to the current government that is working pro-peace. So interestingly, you see alignment of the church based on what is called preservation of traditional values with more the conservative traditionalist, let's say, end of the political spectrum that's aligning itself with Russia, and also revanchist rhetoric towards potentially regaining control of Karabakh. So you see almost an oppositional movement from the church towards the government. In no case I've seen any involvement, again, in the peace process, neither from internally nor by any outside faith groups so far. It would be great to see it. It's definitely missing angle.
So I'm an outside observer on this issue, and Phil really knows intimately closer the dynamics when it comes to faith-based organization and their involvement. But one outside observation is the reason for the weakness in ties could be a product of the fact that until very recently, Armenia and its politics were strongly under Russian influence. Russians had, Armenia was in CSTO, Russia controlled its borders and wielded an enormous amount of influence over Armenian politics, handpicking governments, supporting oligarchs, and so on and so forth, until the Velvet Revolution, so to speak, or the street revolutions of 2018, when you had a government that came into power democratically through street demonstrations and opened up Armenia's ties with the West. Almost too late, because some of the countries like Ukraine and Georgia had gone through this phase earlier. But it is still very important, and civil society is blossoming in Armenia. If you go to Yerevan, it's really experiencing a sort of a very colorful social and civil society scene. But it is new, relatively new. And I'm going to say maybe something slightly provocative here. It is also the case that Armenia's Armenia, the country's relationship with the Armenian diaspora in the West, isn't exactly a full alignment. Much of the Armenian diaspora in this country, in the United States, is Armenians who have fled Ottoman Empire, descendants of Armenians who have fled Ottoman Empire and and therefore more focused on issues around the genocide recognition. And of course, recently they have been involved in Nagorno-Karabakh the conflict, but they're not exactly the diaspora of Armenia, the country. They are the diaspora of Armenians from all the territories Armenians have historically lived, very focused on historic reconciliation, historic issues, as opposed to the sort of Armenia, its current needs and developments and positioning and vulnerability and so on. So I see a huge difference when I look at Armenia, the relationship it has or doesn't have really with the Armenian diaspora in this country, with the type of relationship we would see between Israeli communities and politics, and Israeli-American communities, Israeli-American diaspora here. So that difference may also be part of the reason faith-based organizations have not really focused on what is happening in Armenia.
Thank you. I'm going to go next to Elise Cannon. If you could identify yourself, that would be great.
Yes. So this is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. So my first name is May. I'm the executive director of an organization called Churches for Middle East Peace. And you spoke to my question a little bit in your last response, but my question is, can you explain a little bit more about what's happened specifically in the last year and the displacement from Nagorno-Karabakh, but the negotiations in light of, I was going to say, the region's history, which you started to talk about, but specifically the Armenian perspective that I hear often from diaspora about the displacement being identified as ethnic cleansing or a continuation of the genocide. You know, this idea of connecting what's happening today to the history of the Armenian people, as an ongoing erasure, not only of Armenian culture and identity, but the historical Christian identity of the region and territory. And my question ultimately is, how legitimate is the fear that the goal of Turkey and Azerbaijan could be or is the complete eradication of Armenia and its Christian identity? I mean, that's something that we hear. And is that legitimate at all? And the argument that's used is the displacement of the population from Nagorno-Karabakh is evidence of that continued, ethnic cleansing, if you will.
Who would like to go first? Asla, I see you are unmuted.
I think that it would be too far to say, certainly would be an exaggeration to say the goal of Turkey and Azerbaijan is the eradication of Armenian identity or the country. I do think that Turkey would prefer normalization with Armenia and opening its border, which then provides a direct access to Azerbaijan, Central Asia, and really opens an incredibly valuable, resourceful trade route for Turkey all the way into China. It's called Middle Corridor, and Turkish pundits are almost obsessed with it. It is just that they have developed a very strong strategic relationship with Azerbaijan, which wields enormous influence over Turkish public opinion, and they don't want to normalize relations or open the border until there is a peace deal. This is a reality of Turkish politics and that sort of relationship Turkey has established solidified with Azerbaijan. I think that Turkish and Azeri goals are not necessarily overlapping, but they are similar. Azerbaijan is not, one of the issues is Azerbaijan is not desperate for peace, whereas Armenia is very vulnerable at the moment and is really eager for peace. Turkey would like peace, but isn't going to push Azerbaijan to jeopardize its relationship with this sort of influential oil-rich country. So there is a possibility of coming up with a framework whereby you can manage this conflict, as Phil has pointed out, and essentially open transit roads and sort of prevent further fighting and war, and really prevent the type of catastrophe that you have talked about. I have to say that there is a maximalist narrative that is coming out of Azerbaijan that is worrisome to watchers, people who watch this conflict, including US officials that have invested somewhat in the peace process, on again, off again. There are also all these issues that Phil has talked about in an earlier question: hate speech, maximalism, racism, normalization of violence, and these are deep issues that are not necessarily addressed, but can only be done so within the context of peace treaty or sort of a de-escalation. So I am not necessarily thinking that Turkey shares the same ideas with Azerbaijan. They would not like to see further fighting. But if Azerbaijan decides to embark on further fighting to claim territory, a part of that is now a part of Armenia, I am not, I don't think they would publicly oppose that.
Phil?
Yeah, I don't think there is any kind of monolithic answer in general. Yeah, so it's not like Turkey or Azerbaijan have some specific policy that is continuation from the 19th century that until today. I think things change, and I think there are different fractions and policies and politics in each community. In 2000s, I would see this proposition as kind of very marginal. So this kind of a logic that there is some kind of continuity of policy and there is an interest of ethnic cleansing. I don't think that was the case at all. The time there was, right? So there were many chances in the 90s and 2000s. There were many chances to solve this conflict. The politics of the day, again, the norms of the day were very different. Again, the region, Turkey was moving towards European Union and was democratizing. So the structures, international structures within which this conflict was being addressed were very different from the ones today. At the same time, even then, you had perhaps somewhat marginal groups of nationalist Turks, nationalist Azerbaijanis, also nationalist Armenians who would like to see complete ethnic cleansing and the eradication of the other side. You always have these voices. Now things change. If I think if in again 90s, 2000s, seeing this kind of takeover of a country, eradication of population was a non-starter somewhat, so it would not be tolerated. There would be interventions. Things change. What we are seeing today in Gaza, what we are seeing in Ukraine, that suddenly mass violence is becoming normalized. The reaction is yes there, but potentially muted. And that potentially does open up a door for quite fascist type of movements that can talk about solution of a problem through full ethnic cleansing. Suddenly it's not as unthinkable as it would have been 5, 10, 15 years ago. So again, I think the elements within Turkey, within Azerbaijan, who were voicing full eradication of Armenians were there. They were very marginal. I'm not excluding that possibility anymore. I would be 5, 10 years ago. And I'm not also ascribing some kind of particular nationalism to Turks and Azerbaijanis. Only Armenians, when they had the upper hand, had very extremely nationalist narratives and did not let any Azerbaijani return home, fully excluding any possibility of coexistence or, again, Azerbaijani rights of human rights or minority rights of Azerbaijanis who were displaced from Armenia. So essentially, in both sides, the nationalism is present, sometimes has a strong political voice. It's at this point, Armenia being a far weaker politically and militarily side, if there is a conflict. You can potentially expect much worse violence than we've seen in the past.
I'm going to go next to Bob Roberts.
Thank you, Irina. Appreciate it. Three quick questions with three
Bob,
quick
can you
answers.
identify yourself? I'm sorry.
Yes, Bob Roberts. I'm president of Multi-Faith Neighbors Network and Institute for Global Engagement. Three quick questions with three quick answers. Number one, sometimes in a conflict, there's a single factor. If you can get the ball rolling on that, it changes everything. Is there a factor like that in this? And if so, what is it? Would it be an open channel connecting Azerbaijan to its dislocated section on the other side, as I'm sure you're aware? Number two, what are the first three steps? You would say, if peace is going to happen, here are three things that have to happen. Here are the first three things I would focus on. Thank you.
I guess I'll go first. There is Azerbaijan has an exclave, an enclave closer to the Turkish border that it's disjointed and wants a land bridge over this territory, which is Armenia. So it's two Azeri territories, Azerbaijan proper and this other territory, and Armenia in between. They do want a land bridge, and it is presented, the issue is at this point, will they accept the crossroad, the transit route that Armenia is offering, or will they not, or will they try to open it and reclaim that territory and open that territory, which is currently Armenia, which is historically Armenia, and sort of try to do it militarily? I do think, yes, it is coming down to that land bridge, the transit corridor, or whatever we call it, the transit route. Armenia has recently put forth a proposal called Crossroads for Peace, basically saying they're willing to open this, but it is sovereign Armenian land, would have to be controlled by Armenia. And so much of the sort of recent negotiations has been around this. The problem is, in principle, both countries agree that there should be this corridor, this land bridge, this sort of transit route, and that Azerbaijan should have access to this exclave, and that, eventually linking it up with Turkey. So to me, it seems like sort of a really sad that there is an agreement on what needs to happen, but it is, for some reason, the details, where the passport control will be, how the trucks pass, whose territory it is. We have come this far in negotiations, and with both sides agreeing to the existence of this transit route. So it would be a real shame if they step back and engage in fighting, just sort of thinking of this as an opportunity somehow. I think Armenia does fear that Azerbaijan will go ahead and open this road militarily. Also because of the more sort of maximalist language that is coming out of Azerbaijan now. But this is where international community could be helpful, important, and really put its foot down and say, you want a road, we will build it, we will provide the modality. It can be like this model, that model, and really put the funding for it. We're talking about a very, very small piece of territory. But what are the first three steps, or what is another issue that would make a difference? I think Turkey could make a difference and unlock this conundrum in a way that is more impactful than the sort of Western-led mediation efforts, if Ankara was to lean in a little bit and convince Azerbaijan to go ahead and sign a peace deal with Armenia. This whole thing benefits Turkey enormously, strategically, in terms of sort of a really important historic reconciliation, but also trade-wise. So if they could lean in and sort of provide the type of guarantees Azeris will have, this can happen. It's a question of, convincing Turkey to go ahead and really play a more constructive role in this process. Right now, they're hands off. They're not playing a destructive role, and their position is, Turkey's position is, we'll support whatever Azerbaijan decides. But I think Turkey leaning in a little bit and convincing Azerbaijan could really change the dynamics there. Maybe that would be the big sort of single issue I would highlight.
Great. Philip, we'll go to you, and then we'll take the next question from Margaret Kibben. So Philip, if you want to add, and then we'll move to the next question.
I will actually go even further and put Turkey as that single important factor column. I think the Turkey not normalizing, not opening the border with Armenia, essentially keeping it fully economically dependent on Russia is the biggest obstacle to moving forward, or biggest obstacle, but also could have been the biggest step forward towards normalization, at least abiding by the agreements that are already reached. Last summer, there was an agreement reached. There were negotiators appointed at President Erdogan's prompting between the two sides. They agreed on some small steps, such as opening the border between Armenia and Turkey for third-party nationals only, not for Armenians and Turks, but for third parties, for diplomatic passport holders. It was supposed to open until July of 2023. It's still not open. Turkey essentially just backtracked on that. So why Turkey is so important? Because from Armenian perspective, they are willing to, or accepting a lot of the conditions by Turkey and Azerbaijan, but they see even whatever is agreed upon not being actually followed up upon by neither Turkey nor Azerbaijan, and that creates a lot of hesitation of, it's more essentially any step that Armenia, any compromise Armenia makes, gonna be followed by further demand without even what's agreed upon being fulfilled by the opponents. So from that perspective, Turkey is, again, very important step for Armenia to open up to the world outside of Russia. It's also important to see that what's at least agreed upon, not more than you agreed, but what you agreed is being fulfilled. So I put that as first. Second, peace agreement that has very concrete between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So I'll put a second, not first. Second, with very concrete agreement of which map should be used for demarcation delimitation. Azerbaijan is in favor of peace agreement, but refusing to agree on anything concrete. And the history of last 3 years shows that means that Azerbaijan at every place then going to be pushing further into the Armenian territory. So without a concrete map on which the demarcation can be done, it becomes essentially a paper that gives Azerbaijan and Turkey potentially a carte blanche to encroach into Armenian territory. So concrete peace agreement with a specific map attached to it. And then third, I would agree also with the US and overall Western mechanisms of guarantee of implementation of these two provisions, right? So if there is an opening a road given by Armenia to Azerbaijan to pass, if there is a peace agreement, demarcation will be made. There should be a mechanism of arbitration in case you have disagreements that later lead to escalation. Right now, there is no mechanism through which any disputes could be solved. So I'd say Turkey abiding by its already made agreements and promises, peace agreement, concrete peace agreement, and then mechanisms for arbitration would be three.
Thank you. Let's go to Margaret Kibben.
Hi, thank you both very much for this marvelous conversation. My name is Margaret Grund-Kibben. I'm the chaplain of the House of Representatives and have been very much interested in the conversations that are taking place here in the House, and have really come to an awareness, or a very moderate awareness of things that are going on in Armenia and Azerbaijan, particularly with Nagorno-Karabakh. But my question is, this is an amazing presentation of the geopolitical situation. You've talked a lot about foreign policy, you've talked about diplomacy, but we are at a religion and foreign policy quorum here. And I've heard a couple comments about faith-based organizations or religions. I won't say that they are throwaway comments, but they don't get a whole lot of depth from you. I'm wondering if it's probably because of something that one of you said, which was that the diaspora, in other words, the people who are informing our media and informing us, are not in full sync with current Armenian issues or current Armenians. And so the problems that the diaspora are putting forward might have a more religious flavor to them, or that's the lens through which they're watching this series of events here in the conflict. Things like, are we going to lose our Christian heritage of Armenia? Are they targeting Christians? Or is it fact they're just targeting Armenians? So I guess my question is, if you could, in one or two sentences, what is it that the faith-based organizations are not addressing but could be? And where could there be religious dialogue in the diplomatic efforts? Where are there areas where there are clerics within Armenia or even Azerbaijan who might be able to bring something to the table to enable the peace talks, not just for trade, but for peace, and to minimalize the maximalist narrative?
Can I start this one, I guess? So yeah, that's I fully agree that it's been very much underutilized, not really looked upon dimension. Overall, the faith in both communities been growing. Again, they started 30 years ago with a relatively small percentage of population actively participating in religion, but that has been very actively changing. And in that sense, you do have many more, much bigger part of the population in both countries that are believers and do have religious leaders to whom they could listen to, and that interfaith dialogue has not been again organically never emerged, so they never reached out to each other other than by again one or two invitations to Moscow of the very high level leadership. But I think that could be something that could be actively promoted by others who do have much longer experience of interfaith dialogue. In the US, it's certainly a very major, has been very, very active. You see in the Middle East that has been very active, so it could certainly learn from it, and would be great to see, frankly, an involvement or a push or prompting by those with more experience in interfaith dialogue who can offer their know-how and their experience.
Asla?
Can you hear me? Sorry, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Yes, I mean, I do agree with Phil. The interfaith dialogue is missing. Civil society dialogue is missing. I think their efforts to get it off the ground, like Phil, your organization, but the two societies have demonized each other very intensely within a very short span of time, historically speaking, from living in diverse multicultural communities to living in more homogeneous societies shaped by the sort of hate speech and racism, and that there is a role for interfaith organizations in reversing that picture. It's a dialectical relationship between politics and society, feeding off each other, and really there needs to be a stop somewhere. And I think external organizations stepping in and initiating interfaith conversation would be very, very important. I think the second issue is what I raised before. Armenia, the country and its people, need to be in sync with Armenian diaspora and vice versa. Armenian diaspora also needs to be more understanding and interested in the sort of immediate concerns of Armenia, the country, and the quest for peace there, which is more or less necessity for survival. What we're seeing is Armenian government being extremely flexible in these negotiations, in part because Armenia is extremely vulnerable and cannot afford not to have peace with its very powerful and increasingly militarized neighbor, and Turkey. And with Russia waiting for any moment of weakness to take over the country, it's just not an option. I don't see the diaspora groups here rallying behind this peace agenda. Maybe that they're focused on Armenian identity, culture, religion, and so on, and really also have focused on Nagorno-Karabakh. But when it comes to political alignment in sort of supporting the government's proposition that peace is an absolute necessity for Armenia to survive, I don't see the diaspora really on board. And I think that seems to be an internal Armenian issue, but very, very important.
We have one written question from Thomas Walsh, who is president of the Universal Peace Federation. Interested to know if NATO is playing any significant role, in, for example, leveraging, leverage with Turkey, or is NATO's presence overly provocative to Russia, a la Ukraine?
Shall I?
Yes, go ahead.
I think NATO is, to be perfectly honest, I think NATO's presence would be very provocative at this point. We should not make promises to Armenia that we cannot keep. And while everyone in Europe and here in the US is very receptive to the message that's coming out of Armenia now, we want to get closer to the West. We are interested. I was just watching an interview, incidentally, on Turkish channel TRT World with Armenian foreign minister. For the first time, really, something like this happened. An Armenian foreign minister saying our societies are, basically what he said, our societies are interested in, have European aspirations. And that is a big, big statement. It's just an inconvenient time for that geopolitically in terms of Western countries really fully supporting Armenia and also providing the kind of immunity that might follow if there's a reprisal from Russia. What can be done? What can be done is supporting Armenia in incremental steps, economically, in militarily, establishing new relations. Armenia is not where Ukraine is, nor is it where Ukraine was in 2022. It is coming much, much too late into this world, this game, so to speak, getting in terms of seeking a Western orientation. So it has to be a deliberate, incremental, but also decisive step. I have no doubt in my mind, after having visited Armenia, that there is an enormous determination on the part of society to break out of Russian influence, to establish relations with the West, and so on. It's very clear on the street, not just pro-government people, but whoever you talk to. But we also have to be cognizant of our own limits and shortcomings. There have been US-Armenian joint military exercise, which was very, very small, tiny, more symbolic. And 2 days afterwards, Azerbaijan started a military offensive into Nagorno-Karabakh, an issue that Armenia and the West has not been able to support Armenia. So that is a reminder of the kind of limits of US power, of NATO power, and also the type of constraints that are out there. I think supporting Armenia, Armenian resilience, Armenian society, and supporting economically and pro-Western orientation and are all very important, and steps that could take place over the next couple of years. Maybe on to Phil from here.
Yes, Philip, you get the last word before we wrap up.
I mean, if in this one, I fully agree with Ashley that I think both, yes, so the direct NATO involvement that's maybe few steps removed and outright dangerous, as we can see in Ukraine, it will not go well for Armenia, and the support is not there. Turkey in that region is not playing fully a game of a NATO member, but it has completely its own relationship with Russia, which is different from the rest of the NATO, let's say. But having said that, again, on the flip side, yeah, more incremental but systematic support for Armenian integration work for the West, I think, is important, and on Armenian end, knowing that that's, again, it's a policy and it's not just opportunistic move on the end of the US and France and so on. I think that's really important because they are taking a big risk trying to diversify their foreign policy and economy.
We're out of time, but thank you both. This was really a terrific discussion, very insightful, and we appreciate your taking the time to be with us.